All right, let's just dive right into this explainer, because today we are exploring the hidden, frankly, mind-blowing apocryphal accounts of a story you probably thought you knew front to back. For centuries, the life of Jesus of Nazareth has been arguably the most widely told story in the world. But if you actually look closely at the standard texts, there is a massive gap in the narrative. So today, we're going to dig into the alternative ancient texts that attempted to fill that exact gap.
So the absolutely crucial point we need to start with is this glaring silence in the canonical texts about his adolescence and early adulthood. It presents a massive historical mystery. According to the authorized standard gospels, we get this one brief little glimpse of Jesus at the temple when he's 12. And then, well, crickets. Literally nothing, until he just suddenly appears at age 30 to begin his ministry.
And this perfectly illustrates what you might call the iceberg effect. The Orthodox Gospels, they're really just the tip. While beneath the surface, there lies this massive body of divergent, non-canonical traditions desperately trying to fill in the blanks. Early Christians were, understandably, intensely curious about this silent period. So an entire genre of literature, the Apocrypha and Gnostic texts, emerged to satisfy that curiosity with some incredibly detailed and, honestly, pretty shocking stories. Okay, so here is how we're going to unpack this mystery today. First, the canonical silence, then the apocryphal boyhood, the marriage and missing years, comparing the timelines, Gnostic motifs and doctrines, and finally, the multiple portraits of Jesus. Let's get into it.
Starting right off with part 1, the canonical silence.
What's wild is that the early Orthodox writers had virtually no historical information regarding his early influences, and they chose to focus almost entirely on the final year of his ministry. Take the Gospel of Mark, for instance. It's the earliest narrative gospel, written around 70 CE, and it just suddenly introduces Jesus as a fully grown adult. The author felt absolutely no need to invent a backstory at all. Which brings us to part 2, the apocryphal boyhood, and how later writers decided to give the people what they wanted. Okay, so if we look at the infancy Gospel of Thomas, we get a drastically different portrait. We're talking shocking feats of divine power. This is definitely not the gentle teacher of the New Testament. This is a child learning to wield terrifying, raw cosmic power. Like, if another kid accidentally bumps into him, he strikes them down. When the parents come over to complain about it, he strikes them blind. It's intense. Yeah, as this quote really highlights, this apocryphal boyhood narrative is a far cry from the Orthodox version. The sources describe this incredibly dark, mythological picture of a kid just experimenting with immense supernatural ability. Honestly, he resembles a young, somewhat cruel magician a lot more than a savior. But then you have stories like this famous one. Picture this. The child Jesus is playing on the Sabbath, molding these little sparrows out of clay. When an adult scolds him for working on the day of rest, he doesn't argue. He simply claps his hands and the clay birds come to life and fly away. It's such a fascinating look into how ancient writers tried to imagine what raw, unpolished, divine power would actually look like manifesting in a toddler. Now let's move on to part 3, marriage and the missing years. This is where things get super surprising. If we check out the Gospel of the Holy 12, the missing years are actually mapped out. At age 18, Jesus marries a woman named Miriam. They are married for exactly 7 years, until, tragically, she passes away when he is 25. Following her death, a grieving Jesus travels down into Egypt. Why? To study ancient wisdom, meditate in the desert, and fast, returning only at age 30 for his baptism. But wait, there is a really fascinating historical absence here. Despite detailing his marriage and his widowhood, these sources explicitly lack any mention whatsoever of him producing offspring. Even in these highly inventive, non-canonical texts that literally give him a wife, there is absolutely no mention of a bloodline. And there's a reason for that. The texts actually go out of their way to philosophically detach the concept of eternal resurrection from the earthly institution of marriage and procreation. The sources show us that both canonical and non-canonical texts often shared this spiritual worldview, the idea that the physical acts of marriage and childbirth belong entirely to the temporary earthly realm, not the eternal divine kingdom. So let's look at part 4, comparing the timelines. How do these two competing narratives actually stack up? Stacking them side by side like this reveals a pretty stark contrast, right? The Orthodox column is essentially just empty space until age 30. Meanwhile, the apocryphal narrative creates this incredibly detailed bridge of human tragedy and mystical training. It really shows us two entirely different ways early Christians sought to understand their central figure. One group preferred a mysterious adult teacher who just arrives on the scene, while another clearly required a fully fleshed out human journey of love, loss, and mystic initiation.
Moving to part 5, Gnostic motifs and doctrines. Let's explore the theological ideas that fueled these alternative histories.
A lot of this stems from a concept called Docetism. This was a form of Gnosticism that completely bypassed his physical childhood altogether. You see, some Gnostics believed that the spirit was purely good and physical matter was inherently evil. Therefore, the divine Christ couldn't possibly be a physical flesh and blood baby who had to grow up, eat, and sleep. To them, he simply emerged as a purely spiritual presence, a sort of divine phantom.
And it wasn't just that. These non-canonical groups integrated heavy Eastern philosophical themes into their texts, which strongly contrasted with Orthodox beliefs. Unlike their Orthodox brethren, many Gnostic Christian movements actually incorporated concepts of karma and reincarnation directly into their understandings of Jesus' teachings. So in this Gnostic worldview, the historical figure is essentially transformed into an avatar of esoteric life-renewing mysteries. Jesus is seen less as a straightforward historical teacher from Galilee and more akin to Eastern concepts of a mythical avatar, a spiritual presence trying to awaken humanity from its sleep through all that secret knowledge he gained during his missing years in Egypt. Finally, part 6, multiple portraits of Jesus. Let's bring this all together to understand why only one of these portraits survived in the mainstream. The ultimate turning point for all this mutable mythology was, as it often is, political intervention. In the 4th century, Emperor Constantine needed to unify the Roman Empire, and to do that, he officially sided with the Orthodox version of Christianity. The Gnostic texts, with their wild stories of clay sparrows, the tragic death of a wife named Miriam, and Eastern concepts of karma, well, they were branded as heresies, silenced and largely destroyed. Which leaves us with this. History is so often just the version of the story that managed to survive. Just imagine for a second if these apocryphal texts had been bound into the standard Bible. The story of the missing years, the young, terrifying magician, the grieving widower, the Egyptian mystic, would just be common knowledge today. It really leaves us with a fascinating question. How much power lies not just in the stories themselves, but in whoever gets to choose which stories we're allowed to remember?